office. The Transition to Federalism campaign and the Drug Abuse Treatment and Rehabilitation Center Interagency Task Force Project Management Office, and serves as the supervising authority of the Planning Service and Information System Technology Management Service of the DILG. Prior to his assumption as Assistant Secretary for Plans and Program of the DILG, Asik Densing III was the Chief Executive Officer of Medicare Plus Incorporated and managed large companies involved in banking, finance, real estate, telecommunications, and agribusiness, among others. Asik Densing III has 2 bachelor's degrees in Humanities and Accountancy from the De La Salle University. He is also a professor at the Ateneo Graduate School of Business, a certified public accountant, a certified management accountant, and Master of Business Administration. He received his MBA degree with a gold medal for academic distinction, having been a first honor student in all terms. In the 2017 Real Estate Brokers Licensure Examinations, he landed 16th out of 9,900 examinees. Asik Densing III is currently the National Co-Chairman of the Save the Entire Philippines organization, September 26 movement, which organized the first massive civilian rally at the Quirino Grandstand last September 26, 2016, with the aim to convince Mayor Duterte to run for president. Perhaps there was a typo error here, sir. 2015. Some of the awards and recognition he received include Most Outstanding Student Leadership Medal, De La Salle University's 10 Outstanding Young Men, Most Outstanding Student Legislator, International Champion Debater in Human Rights, and most recently, 10 Outstanding Movers of the Philippines for 2017, and Aliw Broadcasting Company's DWIZ 882 Public Service Award. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Assistant Secretary Epamaco B. Densing III of the Department of Interior and Local Government.
Thank you, Jonathan, for the introduction. I'd like to greet first our panelists who are present this afternoon. Dr. Atienza of the University of the Philippines, Dr. Coronacion of the University of Santo Tomas, and unfortunately not around is Dr. Ang of the Ateneo de Manila. Maybe he found out that the speaker right now is from De La Salle University. That's just joking. Anyway, warm good afternoon to everybody who is present. I'm glad that I was invited to this forum this afternoon to speak to you about federalism. I've been moving around the country since I took over the federalism campaign under the Department of Interior and Local Government since April of this year. When I took over, the awareness level per survey is only less than 4% of the entire Philippines. I just heard a few weeks back that in the recent survey of Publicos Asia, the awareness amongst Filipinos of about federalism has already gone up to 33%. So I'm a little proud that we have done a lot to be able to make the Filipino masses understand federalism. When I took over also, we had 2 workshops, primarily so that we can have what we call a common messaging. The primary problem we had prior to April of this year was everybody is confused. Second, they do not want to understand the technicalities and boredom of understanding the political structure of federalism. So what I did was to have 2 messaging. One message is for the Filipino masses, and these are for the barangays. We have a barangay-based module, and we partnered with people's organizations with CSOs and other private groups so that we can spread a common module for the barangays. It's a module good for 30 minutes. It talks about the basics of federalism. And more importantly, it talks about what the people want. What is the impact or effect of federalism to the people's lives? Because it's a boredom to them to talk about federalism, the structures and the technicalities, when what they want is to understand federalism and how it impacts their lives. And my primary issue there is, if in the current system you're only eating 2 times a day, in federalism we want to assure you that you will eat 3 to 4 times a day, an improvement of the people's lives. The second level of discussion is what we're going to do this afternoon, which is to have a common understanding of the political structures, the technicalities, and the importance of the type of leadership under a federal form of government. So we're talking about more complex issues. And I don't have the... okay, to move. Anyway, I'm sure many of you already understand what federalism is. And briefly, federalism as a structure in itself, in summary, is simply a decentralization of powers between the national government and what we call the federal states. And as we talked about with the other groups, which I was focusing a lot on common messaging. That's why I invited a lot of groups for a workshop, and we've done this 3 weeks ago for us to have a common structure to talk about in public. This included PDP Laban Federalism Institute, Centrist Democratic Party, Kulusang Pagbabago, MMDM, mula sa Masa Duterte Movement. I think there was a group, Pagbabago sa Federal ng Pilipinas. So in other words, a multi-sectoral group which I personally sat down with them and I personally facilitated for us to have a common understanding or language. Because again, the worst thing that could happen to us is for us to be confused about the modeling. So that's why here we're trying to promote what we call the model for Philippine federalism. And mind you, and I know you are all educated, federalism is spelled as Federalism. Because there's a group that's moving around who's spelling federalism is PH. And I know the intention, but the problem is people now get confused. Even the most intelligent ones got confused with the spelling. So much more if you bring the spelling to the Filipino masses. So I'd like to correct that notion. So we use the letter F, not PH. So based on our understanding, we agreed first on common terms. So one common term is that for purposes of the national government, we call it the federal government. And for purposes of the federal states, we call them the regional government. So many of the groups who attended the workshop agreed that we will use those terms. No? Federal government for the national government and federal and regional government for federal states. So with that kind of a setup, it's an issue of now sharing the powers between that of the national government and the regional government, or the federal government and the regional government. Our problem right now, for all our understanding, is our current system is very much centralized. The unitary form of government is centralized in the sense that much of the decision-making process is with the central government, the president, for that matter. In fact, our current setup says that all taxes collected are centralized first in Imperial Manila or Imperial Metro Manila, to which, under the law, 40% of all national taxes collected are now distributed as internal revenue allotment or IRA amongst local government units, and they have their own apportionment of the 40%. In the current year's budget, that's supposed to be around 400 to 500 billion. So the problem there is if everything is centralized, then a lot of politics can come into the picture. If a local government officials or officials of local governments are not in the same political party as that of the national government, or they are what we call pasaway to the ones of the national government officials, it's possible that their internal revenue allotments release may be delayed. The worst scenario there is it will not even be released at all. And that's really happening for many decades, no, since the local government code was enacted into law. In fact, in the previous year, then Congressman, now Governor of Batangas, Governor Mandanas, filed a criminal case against the officials of the previous administration because close to 500 billion worth of internal revenue allotment from 2010 to 2015 were never released to many local government units. Just think about what that 500 billion can do in the rural areas, in the provinces. So these are 500 billion worth of infrastructure that was not, infrastructure and basic services that was not released to many of our LGUs. For whatever reason, and I'm sure politics is part of it. So that's our problem. So what do we need to do? So since everything is centralized in the federal form of government, since the basic services or services are now shared between the national, between the federal government and the regional governments, there is now that need that the budget much of the budget should now be retained by the regional government. So if the major services such as, let's say, Department of Education, Social Welfare, healthcare services, public safety, are now devolved or decentralized to the regional government, and what is only left in the national government is foreign policy, monetary policies, most probably the National Guard, Armed Forces of the Philippines, immigration, which is much lesser than what they have right now at present, then it goes to follow that much of the budget should now be with the regional governments. That's why for purposes of budgeting, if today 40% is remitted as IRA to the LGUs, our best estimates as of the moment, subject to a verification or study that we've commissioned a certain group, is we estimate 70 to 80% of all national taxes collected per region will now be retained by the regional government because many of the services are now retained by them. 20 to 30% are to be remitted as their contribution to national government operations. So with that, we are now talking about a government much closer to the people, funding much closer to the people, so services goes much closer to the people. And with that kind of a setup, we talk about an ideal setup where governance, services, and most probably government officials themselves are much closer to the people. So many local government officials did not go to the national government to plead, to beg for additional funding for their needs. They only need to go to the regional government, to which the funding is now with them. So that's the setup. That's the very ideal setup. And because government is now much closer to the people, services can now be given to them. Now, next slide, please. Now, with regard to the specific reason why we also need to shift. Again, I have to go back to the primary reason or objective why we need to go to federalism. There is no other reason why we are shifting from our current political structure to a federalist type of a structure. No other reason but economic viability of the Filipinos' lives. No more, no less. It's all about economics. It's all about economy. It's all about improving people's lives. The political structure is just the vehicle to be able to promote that federalism structure, to promote or to improve people's lives. Because if a political or a shift of political structure will not improve people's lives, then it is entirely useless. So again, the end objective is to improve our lives. Remember, the current poverty incidence in our country is at 22%. As economists, some of you here are economists, I consider the period 2010 to 2015 as a failure of the Philippine economy. We were the second fastest economy in Asia in that period, second only to China. We were growing at a pace of an average of 6.2%. But it's a failure. As an economist, I considered it a failure because that growth never went into the Filipinos' pockets. Our poverty incidence continued to be between 22 to 27%, one of the worst in Southeast Asia, despite the fact that our economic growth was the fastest in Southeast Asia. Malaysia has a poverty incidence of 2%. Thailand has a poverty incidence of 10%. Vietnam has a poverty incidence of 7%. Singapore only has less than 1% in poverty incidence. And despite the fact that we were the fastest economic country in terms of growth in Southeast Asia. Our poverty incidence was only between 22 to 27%. That's the time where we can use the Filipino adage, where the rich became richer and the poor became poorer. And again, as a proof, in 2010, there were only 4 Filipinos who were part of the Forbes billionaires list. By the end of 2015, there were now 14 Filipinos in the Forbes billionaires list. Primarily because everything is centralized in the national government. Once we start to regionalize, economic activity will also start to regionalize. Okay, next slide, please. One important thing that we need to address is the peace in Mindanao, as what has mentioned by the President. Again, the reason why there is rebellion in Mindanao, I am from Mindanao, is because many of our Muslim brothers and sisters were not given the right justice in terms of improving their lives. Many Muslims, as of today, are jobless. Many Muslims do not have jobs. Many Muslims are uneducated. Many Muslims are poor. In fact, as of 2015, poverty incidence in ARMM is 53%. More than half of those in the Muslim region of Muslim Mindanao is more than half is poor. The average poverty incidence in the whole of Mindanao is close to 38 or 39%, worse than the national average, because much of the funding does not go there. In fact, if I tell you right now, in 2016, the internal revenue allotment for the whole of Mindanao, if you compute it in 2016, is close to 96 billion of the whole of Mindanao in 2016. If, for example, in 2016 we are already under a federal form of government, and with the assumption that there's an 80-20 sharing in the taxes collected, retained by the island of Mindanao, and with the assumption that Mindanao contributes to 15% of the Philippine economy, Mindanao could have received as their retained taxes close to 250 billion. Just look at the difference, 96 billion versus 250 billion if you're under the federal form of government. That money would have been more than enough to give progress to Mindanao. And if progress comes into Mindanao, our Muslim brothers get educated, they get livelihood, they get to earn money, they will definitely bring down their arms. And that is the reason, and that the President is right, peace and order, if we'll go to Mindanao, it will develop Mindanao as an island group in our country. Many of the Filipinos will no longer go to Metro Manila, Cebu City, Iloilo City. They will stay in Mindanao. And many of the Mindanaoans might go back to Mindanao for them to continue with their economic activities because of the potential development that it can do there, especially under a federal form of government. Next, please. So these are the agreed terms, as mentioned a while ago. Next, please. Now, with respect to how many regional governments, okay, it's premature to say how many regional governments we should have. Some say 6, 11, 3, 17. With all due respect to all the other protagonists, it has no legal basis. It has no economic basis. It has no feasible basis of saying it should be divided that way. That's why the Department of Interior and Local Government, through our Local Government Academy, we have commissioned the Local Government Development Foundation to do a study to correctly give us a recommendation of how many regions we should have, how many regional governments. And the basis should always take into consideration, one, the financial assets and liabilities of the LGUs. Second, the revenue generation possibility or activities of that region. Second, geographical location. And third, cultural diversity. All of this must be considered before we say that these local government units should form part of a regional government. So with all due respect, I will not mention how many, but what is definite, it is under a federal form of government, there will be regional governments. Next. Okay, these are the these are the concepts of a federal form of government. Despite the fact that we already have a federal government and regional governments, we